What did the Church in the High Middle Ages teach about the Jews? Throughout the High Middle Ages, the Magisterium and saints made it very clear that the Jews were the enemies of Christians and should be seen as such. The Church made it clear that the Jews killed Christ and cursed themselves, are faithless and perfidious, are to be permanently dispersed throughout the world, are to serve Christians, that Christians cannot serve them, that their legal testimony is to be held in lower esteem than Christian testimony, that they cannot charge excessive usury, that they have to dress differently in public, that they cannot hold public office, that they must give up Jewishness when converting, and that they must forgive interest and defer repayment of loans made to Crusaders. The Church also expelled the Jews multiple times. Now let's look at the passages from these magisterial documents and saints to see what they say. In 1146, writing a letter to the archbishops of the Eastern Franks and Bavarians, Doctor of the Church, St. Bernard of Clairvaux says, "The Jews are living signs to use representing the Lord's passion. For this reason they are dispersed into all regions, that now they may pay the just penalty of so great a crime, and that they may be witnesses of our redemption. Wherefore the Church, speaking in the same psalm, says, 'Scatter them by thy power and bring them down, O Lord, our shield.' So has it been. They have been dispersed, cast down. They undergo a hard captivity under Christian princes." The Third Lateran Council, which convened in 1179 AD under Pope Alexander III, says in Canon 26, "Jews and Saracens are not to be allowed to have Christian servants in their houses, either under pretense of nourishing their children or for service or any other reason. Let those be excommunicated who presume to live with them. We declare that the evidence of Christians is to be accepted against Jews in every case, since Jews employ their own witnesses against Christians, and that those who prefer Jews to Christians in this matter are to lie under anathema, since Jews ought to be subject to Christians and to be supported by them on grounds of humanity alone. If any by the inspiration of God are converted to the Christian faith, they are in no way to be excluded from their possessions, since the condition of converts ought to be better than before their conversion. If this is not done, we enjoin on the princes and rulers of these places, under penalty of excommunication, the duty to restore fully to these converts the share of their inheritance and goods." This canon was the first canon of extraordinary magisterium to oppose the ongoing problem of Jews having Christian servants and slaves, and to combat preferential treatment of Jews in the legal system. Since before this canon, and even afterwards, Jews would use usury to force Christians to serve them and use their wealth to bribe judges and juries to win court cases. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III decreed in the papal bull Ut Esset Cain, as Cain was a wanderer and an outcast, not to be killed by anyone, but marked with the sign of fear on his forehead, so the Jews, against whom the voice of blood of Christ cries out, although they are not to be killed, they must always be dispersed as wanderers upon the face of the earth. Pope Innocent III also decreed in the papal bull anti-Judaeos, although Christian piety tolerates the Jews whose own fault commits them to perpetual slavery and allows them to continue with us, even though the Moors will not tolerate them, they must not be allowed to remain ungrateful to us in such a way as to repay us with contumely for favors and contempt for our familiarity. They are admitted to our familiarity only through our mercy, but they are to us dangerous as the insect in the apple, as the serpent in the breast. Since therefore they have already begun to gnaw like the rat and to stink like the serpent, it is to our shame that the fire in our breasts which is being eaten into by them does not consume them, as they are reprobate slaves of the Lord, in whose death they evilly conspired, or at least by the effect of the deed. Let them acknowledge themselves as slaves of those whom the death of Christ has made free. Pope Innocent III also decreed in the papal bull Etsi non displaciat, although it be not displeasing to the Lord, but rather acceptable to him that the Jewish dispersion should live and serve under Christian princes, they greatly offend in the sight of God's divine majesty, who prefer the offspring of the crucifiers before those who are the heirs of Christ. It has come to our knowledge that in the Kingdom of France, Jews have so much liberty that under a species of usury, by which they not only extort extort the interest, but interest from interest. They obtain control of the goods of the churches and the possessions of the Christians. Furthermore, although it was decreed in the Lateran Council that Jews be not permitted to have Christian servants in their homes, either as tutors for their children or for domestic service, or for any reason whatsoever, they still persist in having Christians as servants and nurses, with whom they commit abominations of a kind which it rather becomes you to punish than us to explain. And again, although the same council laid it down that the testimony of Christians against Jews is to be admitted, even when the former used Jewish witnesses against Christians, and decreed that in a case of this kind, anyone who would prefer Jews before Christians is to be condemned as anathema, yet up to the present time things are so carried on in the Kingdom of France that the testimony of Christians against Jews is not believed, whereas Jews are admitted as witnesses against Christians. And at times, when they to whom Jews have loaned money with usury produce Christian witnesses about the facts of payment, the deed which the Christian debtor through negligence indiscreetly left with them is believed rather than the witnesses whom they bring forward. On Good Friday also, contrary to the law of old, they walk through the streets and public squares, and meeting Christians who everywhere according to custom go to adore the crucifix, they deride them and strive to prevent them from this duty of adoration. We warn and exhort your serene majesty in the Lord, adding the remission of your sins, that you force the Jews from their presumption, and see to it that due punishment be meted out to all such blasphemers, and that an easy pardon be not given to delinquents. Objection. Pope Innocent III was just a mean old anti-Semite. Answer. Despite what your personal opinion is regarding Pope Innocent III, the fact of the matter is that he was a legitimate pope, and his ordinary magisterium did universally teach that the Jews are our enemies, that they killed Christ, cursed themselves, earned a perpetual diaspora, and earned perpetual servitude because of their deicide. He also demanded the Third Lateran Council, Canon 26, be obeyed. His ordinary and universal magisterium requires assent of intellect and will from all faithful under pain of sin. The Fourth Lateran Council, convened by the same Pope Innocent III in 1215 AD, specifically condemned Jewish usury in Canon 67. Jews and excessive usury. The more the Christian religion is restrained from usurious practices, so much the more does the perfidy of the Jews grow in these matters, so that within a short time they are exhausting the resources of Christians. Wishing therefore to see that Christians are not savagely oppressed by Jews in this matter, we are ordained by the synodal decree that if Jews in future or any pretext extort oppressive or excessive interest from Christians, then they are to be removed from contact with Christians until they have made adequate satisfaction for the immoderate burden. Christians too, if need be, shall be compelled by ecclesiastical censure, without the possibility of an appeal, to abstain from commerce with them. We enjoin upon princes not to be hostile to Christians on this account, but rather to be zealous in restraining Jews from so great oppression. We decree under the same penalty that Jews shall be compelled to make satisfaction to churches for tithes and offerings due to the churches, which the churches were accustomed to receive from Christians for houses and other possessions, before they pass by whatever title to the Jews, so that the churches may thus be preserved from loss. The Fourth Lateran Council also says this in Canon 68. Jews appearing in public. A difference of dress distinguishes Jews or Saracens from Christians in some provinces, but in others a certain confusion has developed so that they are indistinguishable. Whence it sometimes happens that by mistake Christians join with Jewish or Saracen women, and Jews or Saracens with Christian women, in order that the offense of such a damnable thing, mixing, may not spread further, under the excuse of a mistake of this kind, we decree that such persons of either sex in every Christian province and at all times are to be distinguished in public from other people by the character of their dress, seeing moreover that this was enjoined upon them by Moses himself, as we read. They shall not appear in public at all on the days of lamentation and on Passion Sunday, because some of them on such days, as we have heard, do not blush to parade in very ornate dress and are not afraid to mock Christians who are presenting a memorial of the most sacred passion and are displaying signs of grief. What we most strictly forbid, however, is that they dare in any way break out in derision of the Redeemer. We order secular princes to restrain with condign punishment those who do not presume, lest they dare to blaspheme in any way him who was crucified for us, since we ought not to ignore insults against him who blotted out our wrongdoings. Here is an example of the yellow badges the church asked the Jews to wear. Here are examples of the Jew hats the Jews were to wear. Additionally, the Fourth Lateran Council says this in Canon 69. Jews not to hold public offices. It would be too absurd for a blasphemer of Christ to exercise power over Christians. We therefore renew in this canon on account of the boldness of the offenders what the Council of Toledo providently decreed in this matter. We forbid Jews to be appointed to public offices, since under cover of them they are very hostile to Christians. If, however, anyone does commit such an office, to let him, after an admonition, be curbed by the provincial council, which we order to be held annually by means of an appropriate sanction. Any official so appointed shall be denied commerce with Christians in business and in other matters until he has converted to the use of poor Christians in accordance with the directions of the diocesan bishop, whatever he has obtained from Christians by reason of his office so acquired, and he shall surrender with shame the office which he irreverently assumed. We extend the same thing to pagans. Also, in Canon 70, the Fourth Lateran Council says, Jewish converts may not retain their old rite. Certain people who have come voluntarily to the waters of sacred baptism, as we learnt, do not wholly cast off the old person in order to put on the new more perfectly. For in keeping remnants of their former rite, they upset the decorum of the Christian religion by such a mixing. Since it is written, Cursed is he who enters the land by two paths, and a garment that is woven from linen and wool together should not be put on. We therefore decree that such people shall be wholly prevented by the prelates of churches from observing their old rite, so that those who freely offered themselves to the Christian religion may be kept to its observance by a salutary and necessary coercion. For it is a lesser evil not to know the Lord's way than to go back on it after having known it. This is essentially a repeat of the 8th canon of the Second Council of Nicaea. Moreover, Canon 71 of the Fourth Lateran Council says this: If any of those setting out on a crusade are bound by oath to pay interest on loans from Jews, we ordain that their creditors shall be compelled by the same punishment to release them from their oath and to desist from exacting the interest. If any of the creditors does force them to pay the interest, we command that he be forced by similar punishment to restore it. We order that the Jews be compelled by the secular power to remit interest, and that until they do so, all intercourse shall be denied them by all Christ faithful under pain of excommunication. Secular princes shall provide suitable deferral for those who cannot now pay their debts to Jews, so that after they have undertaken the journey and until there is certain knowledge of their death or of their return, they shall not incur the inconvenience of paying interest. The Jews shall be compelled to add to the capital after they have deducted their necessary expenses, the revenues which they are meanwhile receiving from property held by them on security. For such a benefit seems to entail not much loss, inasmuch as it postpones the repayment, but does not cancel the debt. Prelates of churches who are negligent in showing justice to crusaders and their families should know that they will be severely punished. The First Council of Lyons in 1245 repeated this canon. Objection: but all of these canons establish disciplines that are no longer in force. Answer: this is true. Disciplines in the church are subject to change. However, all disciplines in the church that the church establishes must be in conformity to Catholic faith and morality. Thus, these disciplines were in conformity to Catholic faith and morality. And again, if you look at what Pope Innocent III and other popes and virtually all the church fathers and doctors taught about the Jews, it is most certainly clear that these disciplines followed from the perennial church teaching on the Jews and were very consistent with them. Moreover, these disciplines were repeatedly brought back by later popes and councils, as we will see in the late Middle Ages and early modernity episode. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX, writing an epistle to the hierarchy of Germany, said, "Ungrateful for favors and forgetful of benefits, the Jews return insult for kindness and impious contempt for goodness. They ought to know the yoke of perpetual enslavement because of their guilt. See to it that the perfidious Jews never in the future grow insolent, but that they always suffer publicly the shame of their sin and servile fear." Moreover, Pope Gregory IX said this to the German bishops: "The Jews who are admitted to our acquaintance only through our mercy should never forget their yoke of perpetual slavery, which they bear through their own fault. In the Council of Toledo, it was decreed that the Jews of both sexes, and for all time, should be distinguished from others by their mode of dress. We therefore command that each and every one of you to have all the excesses of the Jews completely repressed, lest they should presume to raise their necks from the yoke of servitude and contumely of the Redeemer, forbidding them to discuss in any way concerning their faith or rights with Christians. In this matter, calling to your aid the help of the civil power, inflicting upon Christians who offer opposition due ecclesiastical punishment." In the 1234 Decretals of Gregory IX, written by St. Raymond of Peñafort under the orders of Pope Gregory IX, Pope Gregory IX invested the doctrine of perpetua servitude Judaeorum, or perpetual servitude of the Jews, with the force of canonical law. In 1253 AD, Pope Innocent IV allowed the Archbishop of Vienna to expel the Jews because the Archbishop said that the Jewish community was a threat to Christian souls and had not followed the rules set by the Church. In 1271, Angelic Doctor of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas, writes a letter on the treatment of the Jews to Margaret, Countess of Flanders, or to Marguerite, Duchess of Brabant, saying that the Jews, by reason of their fault, are sentenced to perpetual servitude, and thus the lords of the lands in which they dwell may take things from them as though they were their own. Objection: but the Jews cannot be perpetual servants of Catholics. That's not Christian. Answer: well, as we have already seen, that's not what the popes, councils, church fathers, doctors, and other saints believed. The Church made it clear that because of their rejection of Christ, participation in his murder, and the cursing of themselves, that the Jews incurred the just punishment of a perpetual diaspora and servitude in Christian nations. And we will see moving forward that these beliefs have only continued to be reinforced in the Church.